Great. Good to see so many people. Welcome to our keynote address. We are absolutely thrilled to have Professor Leach join us. I would like to introduce my colleague, Catherine Bullshit, professor at the University of Virginia, who will introduce our speaker. Kat.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers who are putting together a fantastic meeting with them. Respectfully, I thank them for giving me the opportunity to introduce a person here, Dr. Leach, who is Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative and is right. I first encountered Dr. Leach's work when I was a very difficult student in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge in 1999. While I raised the university as bookstore, and the local students did exactly 20 pounds to send my books. And what I was seemingly was reading the African Day, which addressed one of the project best taken African college in Rome called Institute. I'm very religious. There were two anthropologists with Leach and Valerie Brown, who's challenging every bit of procedures in what deforestation in West Africa. They attested that the narrative that rapid deforestation being is not only lacking a basis of historical fact, but that, in truth, all the evidence exists to the contrary, namely that it is around human settlements that the forest cover grows most densely. Turns out that people like trees. Was immediately drawn into Dr. Leach's UFA, which ranged from the groundbreaking text, Rainforest Relations, which involved a painstaking collection of the most comprehensive ethobotanical database to date in Sierra Leone and the global rainforests, and her co-authored work with, variously, Dr. Farhad Robin Mears and Ian Scoones, which challenged the neo-Malthusian forestry policies in West Africa that blame local people for rampant deforestation and sound alarmist calls on desertification. In the last decade, Dr. Leach has turned her attention towards land grabs in Africa, most of which occur under the guise of the green transition, and involve dispossessing local people for carbon credit schemes. She achieved all of this in addition to a professional swerve to address the Ebola pandemic in 2014, for which she won the Economic and Social Research Council's Impact Award for establishing the Ebola Emergency Response Platform. From investigating colonial and pre-colonial constructions of what West African forests should look like, to fine-grained analysis of African bioswales, Dr. Leach has a gift for shifting scales and still getting to the heart of the matter. Professionally, she served as the director of ESRC's Social, Technological, and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability Center from 2006 to 2014. She then moved to the directorship of the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex, a position she held from 2014 to 2024, and just this year took up her position as director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. I'm so excited to hear her insights today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Marissa Leach.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for inviting me here. It's a big mix of very old friends and colleagues and some new ones. And what I'm going to be talking about today is partly a revisiting of some of the work that Catherine has kindly alluded to, but I hope in a way that is a little updated and suited to the predicaments that we all find ourselves in today. So my talk is called From Forest Livelihoods to Forest Lifeways, and I hope it can push us a little bit as we collectively think about the future of people and forest together, and what it means really to engage in livelihoods, or what I'm going to suggest going beyond that to begin to elaborate a lifeways approach. So I think there's little doubt that forests and the people who live in and with them are under the global scientific and policy and in the popular spotlight as never before. We see forest-human interactions so often framed as disturbance of natural forest, blamed for all kinds of things, for climate change, for biodiversity loss, related planetary predicaments. But forests are also celebrated for contributing to the solutions, fixing carbon, sustaining water and life, contributing to biodiversity protection, and to multiple sustainable development goals and beyond. But that, of course, is only as long as they're well stewarded. And I think we've also seen a real recognition of the centrality of local communities, indigenous people, those who live in and with forests, in that stewardship. And we see that in long-standing schemes and advocacy for community forest management, for community engagement in forest protection and enhancement, community engagement in the new generation of carbon forestry, as well as in the claims and movements of forest communities themselves. But we see it too, that importance of local stewardship, in its opposite, in the critiques many of us have been involved in of fortress forest protection that excludes and dispossesses, becoming what colleagues and I more than a decade ago now, as Catherine has pointed out, called green grabs, which we analysed then as the appropriation of environments the appropriation of nature for environmental ends. Really a move towards market schemes which were selling nature in order to save it through all kinds of financialized mechanisms, something that we went on to analyse in relation to forest carbon in Africa in the book Forest Carbon Conflicts, with case studies from across the West and East African regions. And more recently, I've been involved with scholars and activists as part of the International Panel of Experts for Sustainable Food Systems, where our latest report on the land squeeze shows how a proliferation of nature finance schemes, carbon markets, plus big area-based conservation are part of a new generation of what we're calling Green Grabs 2.0, squeezing land access, control and use, especially by smallholders and indigenous groups, very much in and around forest areas. So all of this leads me to ask, as I always have in a way, whose forests count and whose goals count? Now, one way to address that, which I'm sure all of you are super familiar with in FLAIR, is through perspectives on forest livelihoods, recognising their significance, support for them in research, in policy and interventions, in fora and gatherings and networks such as FLAIR. And livelihoods approaches, and this is just one example, it's the one that came from my colleagues at IDS, Ian Schoons and others from the early 1990s, just one of the widely used frameworks. They emphasize some really important things, the multiple benefits that people get from forests, the importance of a really enormous variety of resources and services for individuals, for households, for communities, the different capitals involved, and how people combine them in complex and very dynamic ways to survive and hopefully to thrive. And then the importance, context, institutions, and governance conditions which enable that to happen. And I think in the last years, we've also seen livelihoods perspectives interlink in really valuable ways with considerations of equity and justice in forest schemes and in conservation, as well as in just transition arguments in sustainability more generally. So we might now want to ask, as the group of us which came out of the Future Earth programme did here, equity, okay, equity is important, but equity of what, for whom? We might want to pull out different dimensions, different intersections between perhaps gender, class, race, place. We also might want to elaborate on the kinds of equity and justice at work, as we did here, drawing on Nancy Fraser's original, I think, very helpful tripartite distinction between distributive justice, in a sense, the questions about who gets what, procedural justice and equity, asking about how decisions about these things are made, particularly with an emphasis on participation and inclusion of those who might otherwise be marginalized. And then recognitional justice, asking who are the relevant stakeholders, who and what are included and how. And we can envisage combining those, as in this example here from a forest protection scheme in the western area of Sierra Leone, where in the context of our forest carbon work, we looked at how there are actually multiple goals and values at stake. And in this particular project, carbon was one of them, but it sat alongside all sorts of other goals and meanings of forest. And one then ended up arguing for the need for equitable deliberation in procedures to recognize all forest users, including by gender and occupation, to ensure that the distribution of gains and losses was kind of deliberated over and decided about, such that livelihoods of key groups were sustained or enhanced. And I think across the world, we now see many, many examples of trying to apply livelihoods approaches, best practices around thinking about equity and justice, often drawing on frameworks like this, and in very, very helpful ways. But does it go far enough? My argument today, and what I want to kind of lay out for you, is some of my kind of revisiting thinking of some of that earlier work and more recent reflections, that actually appreciation of forest livelihoods and the dimensions of justice that flow from them are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And I want to suggest that we might need greater understanding and recognition and support for what I want to call forest lifeways and the people who are living those lifeways. Livelihoods, I want to suggest, which foreground, I think, above all, the socioeconomic dimensions of people-forest relations, and which tend to focus on the short term, are part of this, but not all. So a lifeways approach, as I'm going to suggest, offers two major additions. The first is here. It's to see how livelihoods are embedded always in what one might call life worlds or worldviews of the people who are living in and with forests, grounded in everyday experiences, sometimes elaborated perhaps as an indigenous philosophy or a theory or a kind of ontology or a cosmology, but not always. Sometimes it's just kind of the way people live and interact. Lifeways, in this sense, don't necessarily follow the nature-culture boundaries that post-Enlightenment science, Western science, are used to dealing with, but tend to place people as part of multi-species entanglements. What I tend to call these days nature kind. People are part of nature, but they're also part of relationships, more than human relationships, which include plants, animals, insects, earths, rocks, water, and all kinds of spiritual beings and more. In African contexts, the Ghanaian anthropologist Francis Nyanjo explores what he calls conviviality in this way. Well, we have people like Etiabo who elaborates Ubuntu, drawing on that Bantu language concept, which considers, to quote, all beings, including humans, gods, spirits, animals, and inanimate beings, belong together in a community of beings. Different kind of notion of a community, more than human communities, as one might put them. And of course, there are innumerable versions in what we might understand as a pluriverse of worlds on this planet that we share. A kind of cultural diversity that extends across local communities and indigenous peoples, but also, I would suggest, is part of everyone's everyday experiences, but often a bit suppressed by our education and the kind of more establishment scientific ways of thinking and acting that we're educated into believing is correct. But these more than human ways of living in different ways all highlight a more interconnected, a more relational set of experiences in which human beings are part and parcel of forest landscapes, rather than a disturbing external element. So the second addition, though, is to see such life worlds, more than human communities and ways of being, as embedded both in space and place and in time. The interconnections between beings are often inscribed in place in the landscape, as I'll show in a minute, through particular vegetation types, sacred places, sacred trees, and so on. Yet also in time, as historical ecologists have long recognized, past events and cultural repertoires, whether linked to climatic events, to pandemics, to economy, to social and political struggles, to conflicts, to patterns of settlement, to infrastructure and building, and indeed interventions like forest protection schemes, similarly leave legacies in ecology. And as forests and their users and inhabitants interact with those events, they become entangled in pathways of change where present conditions are responded to, affecting what can happen next. In a way, building up a set of layered legacies over time, until the forest landscape itself becomes a kind of archive of all that's gone before. People, I think, often memorialize and safeguard these kinds of socio-natural, as one might put it, heritage. And they often become part of claims to place or to territory and to the associated social and political statuses that go with those claims. And crucially, moving to the other side here, what has gone before, pathways of the past, also condition futures, people's understandings and imaginations of what's desirable or dangerous, imaginable or unimaginable, hoped or feared. So this is what I mean by lifeways, these life worlds embedded in historical ecologies that run from the past and might or might not, if suppressed, shape the future. So let's think of some illustrations. And what I want to do now, and really in the rest of this talk, is to turn to some stories from different parts of the pluriverse, which, viewed through a lifeways lens, challenge some of the assumptions that we might have about natural forest disturbance by people. They challenge, too, the assumption that securing livelihoods, at least livelihoods in a narrow sense, is enough to include people. And as I'll come to at the end, they challenge also that kind of tripartite framework for thinking about equity and justice, introducing some further dimensions that we might perhaps want to take seriously. So these are stories that emerge from ethnographic, historical, participatory work, which has been attentive to people's everyday experiences and the perspectives of forest worlds and their more than inhuman inhabitants. The first set emerged from my own work, which, as Catherine has kindly introduced, goes back quite a long way, several decades, and it was very collaborative, both with my British co-authors, James Fairhead, later James Fraser, and our Guinean colleague, Dominique Munamuno, who's been constantly involved as a partner. But crucially, too, with the Kissi, Mende, Karanko, and Loma inhabitants of these forest worlds, who were constantly our hosts and interlocutors. So I'll start with some of those stories and their kind of more recent updates from a lifeways perspective, and then turn more briefly to some other examples from North America and from the UK. So beginning then in West Africa, this is what is often called the tri-border zone between Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. The Upper Guinean forests, so important for animal and plant biodiversity that they're often referred to as a super hot biodiversity hotspot. And over the last decade, they've been a big target for so-called nature-based solutions to climate change and for forest carbon schemes as well. And forest here, the Upper Guinean forest block, is usually, as in this map, portrayed as highly degraded from its original extent. A set of assumptions that I'm going to suggest the lifeways perspective finds a bit of cause to question. So let's start with a bit of this forest, the Ziama Reserve in Guinea, close to the Liberian border, an existing conservation scheme and part of plans for transboundary reserves extending into Liberia too. And this is an area of dense semi-deciduous forest with really important populations of rare endemic birds, reptiles, and especially forest elephants. And it's under pressure, especially for conversion to commercial agriculture in a region really quite seriously impoverished over recent decades by extractive mining, economic decline. Fauna and Flora, big international NGO, which cohabits the building I now work in Cambridge, has been for some time working with the Centre Forestier de Zerikure in the forest region to engage with Loma communities in forest protection, including with alternative livelihoods, to try and encourage communities in the buffer zone not to encroach on the forest for farming. And project communications, as here, often present this as a pristine forest now coming under recent pressure, as if for the first time. But this is a forest whose history is extraordinarily and unusually well documented, not just in the oral traditions of Loma elders, as here in the village of Bo, on the edge of the current reserve, but also in the travel accounts of 3 Americo-Liberians, Anderson, Seymour, and Sims, who walked through the region in the mid-19th century from the coast, the Liberian coast, up into Guinea. And their accounts describe something very, very different. They describe large, wealthy settlements with populations of many thousands, 3, 5, 7,000 people, on trans-African trade routes from the Sahara, of gold, of slaves, of palm kernels, in wall-to-wall rice fields, not forest at all. But with the late 19th century wars associated with colonial occupation and the struggles over trade that happened at that time, the region suffered both massive economic devastation and population decline. And as populations disappeared and fled and moved, forests grew over farms and settlements. And by the 1930s, when the French colonial foresters such as Aubreville surveyed the region and at that point sought to reserve Ziama as part of a curtain of forest reserves across the Upper Ghanaian region, as part of an effort to stop what was then perceived as the southward march of desert-like conditions from the Sahara, it was respectably dense. And by the time kind of what we might think of as modern conservation began from the 1970s, when Ziama was first declared a biosphere reserve, it was very respectable high forest, replete with animal populations, and all too easy to assume or at least to treat as if primary forest. Yet the villagers now living in the buffer zone haven't forgotten this history. And when we took those accounts and took the book we were preparing about them to the villages in the early 1990s, it stimulated a retelling of some very different stories, the stories of decline, the stories of the earlier prosperity, and discussions of the many markers of Ziama's earlier, more than human cohabitation in a thriving forest and human world, which still remain. So we were shown the remains of mud fortifications, some indeed stone fortifications across the border in Liberia that have been discovered more recently. Cotton trees which link to ancestors, cola trees which link to the living, as mothers would plant the umbilical cords of babies, wrapping them around the seeds, thereby linking the tree to the person that a baby would become. The place is used as seclusion for grave sites and for cultural initiations, all of which left legacies in the landscape, bound together in a way, not just by past human settlement, but by the metaphysical power salé, which is a feature for the Loma of ancestors, trees, and many ritual objects. And families related connections to these sites, connections which were severed by forest reservation. And in the 1990s, this became an enormous source of tension with a then European-funded forest conservation project called Projet Fort. And this became slightly humorously known as Projet Mort, Dead Project, such were the tensions and conflicts with the forest guards at that time. And as elders put it then to an NGO that was documenting some of these conflicts, in effect, to summarize, they were saying, give us back control over this forest and we will look after it. These were claims to control, which were in part but about livelihoods, but also about far more. Tensions, I think, simmer to this day, though they're often obscured by the very upbeat project discourse of conservation with development and benefit sharing from forest protection, as well as the well-intentioned and often very sensitive efforts to explain carbon markets, which are increasingly financing conservation in this region, to communities and help them know how to benefit from them. So that the forest landscape is an archive of layered histories and more than human worlds, important to the feelings of belongings, memories and status of families living nearby, is echoed if we move just across the border into Sierra Leone. And this is the Gola Forest, which is where I first lived as a super naive young anthropologist in the late 1980s in a Mende community, where my projects and my studies were all about gender relations and forest livelihoods, how people access, manage, controlled resources in the farms, in the forest, in the fields, and in the streams and hunting resources. But at that time, this same forest was just beginning to attract attention from the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone and the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, RSPB, who established a conservation program and were doing many of the bird surveys in the village where I was living at the time. That program, decades later, is now managed by a partnership as the Gola Rainforest National Park. It's a celebrated example of conservation with development and community engagement. It also became, in 2012, the first Forest Carbon Red Plus program in West Africa. And there is a very celebrated set of socioeconomically very well-informed community engagement processes, and a lot of really important, I think, work on livelihoods and on benefit sharing, which has worked strenuously and carefully to navigate diverse authorities and tenure relations around the reserve in striving for procedural and distributional equity. But again, is this enough? There are some less often told stories that I was hearing when I was there in the late 80s, and that are echoed still again in the visits that I've had since. So elders would relate the history of this area as one in which they settled often in farmland, and they drove back the Gola populations, a different ethnic linguistic group, across the border into Liberia, back behind the water. The forests, as they explained, grew over their abandoned settlements. This was a fleeing that was repeated in the Civil War of 1999 to 2001 across the Sierra Leone-Liberian border, which again gave forests the chance to rebound as a kind of boundary wilderness, unsettled. There are also the stories of people like Safa Kane here, a Kamajo, a member of the Mende Hunters Brotherhoods, with whom in the late 80s I had the privilege of walking in the forest, learning about the plants, the spirits, the hale, the medicinal, metaphysical powers that he used to relate to the animals and the plants around, and to kill, often with respect and in a very selective way. Hearing also his disparaging remarks, as he would put it, about young men with guns who just go out and shoot monkeys for money, in a sense dividing the status of a connected Kamajo from that of people who were hunting for commerce. Forest protection and the outlawing of shotguns in Sierra Leone after the Civil War is, for people like Safa, not just a loss of livelihood, but of status, a status of a special relationship with forest, something he has recaptured in a different way in becoming the village imam. And stories too from women, the women I used to spend quite a lot of time fishing with in streams, where they would be navigating not just with currents and with capricious fish, and the occasional snake one would find in the pools, but also with water beings, with jina like Mama Wata, and for whom power for them was enwrapped with cultural initiation societies and their medicines, and whose masks, imbued again with hale, invoke the fertility of people and their codependent non-human world. So when today's community members ask, as they reasonably do, what has Gola, the project, ever done for us? It seems to me that they're also alluding to this somewhat more embedded and in place sense of ownership and belonging, which in local view perhaps isn't really able ever to be compensated by shares of livelihood benefits that they receive from the carbon projects. Generous as those might be, school fees, contributions to community projects, there is somehow a broader sense of justice that is at stake, framed in rather different terms. So moving north from here, so still in this Upper Ghanaian region, the typical Ghanaian landscape, and we're in the country of Guinea now, is of islands of forest in a sea of savanna grassland, represented from the air in this book cover with the red as forests and the blue as savanna. And scientists and policymakers right back to the 1890s have repeatedly assumed these islands to be the last relics of a great forest cover, destroyed by the shift in cultivation, the fire setting, and the unruly timber felling of the last couple of decades, a continually updated myth of a landscape half empty and emptying forests. And this updating does continue. One of the most recent versions was in 2014 as a supposed explanation for the origins of the West African Ebola epidemic in the village of Meliandu, which was about 5 miles from the villages around Kisidugu, where James and I and Dominique had worked, where the notion of rapid recent deforestation, supposedly bringing people and virus-hosting bats into contact for the first time, raised all kinds of new questions about stopping bushmeat hunting, about forest protection now re-justified to keep people and viral bats apart. A narrative that obscures both the deeply entangled everyday human-bat conviviality in this region. It would be really impossible to separate people and bats if one wanted to. They go back a very long way, as well as local origin stories about the origins of the Ebola outbreak, which focus on some very, very different things, including an origin in human-to-human transmission. The debunking of the narratives about deforestation, backed up by actually the lack of evidence for deforestation, and this is the village of Meliandu, several decades apart. It's not a place where forest was once and has now disappeared. So the debunking of deforestation narratives in this region and the repeated need to do so has been a bit of an enduring endeavor of our team since the early 1990s, with ethnographic and historical work repeatedly revealing this instead as a landscape half full and filling with forest. And Kisi and Karanko villagers who we've worked with reveal this instead as a place where ancestors settled in savanna and where woody vegetation forms around settlements through a mix of intentional practices, people do sometimes plant trees, and unintentional ones. In the 19th century, the main reason was to build fortifications, to look out across the savannah to see Samori Touré's cavalry coming, encouraging some Ceiba cotton trees to grow into their tall form by trimming their branches, and training others to grow into the bushy form that villagers would call forearms, bolonani, to become the sort of lattice for thorny war fences. But then other things too, tethering domestic animals around the village where their grazing would create a kind of natural fire break, encouraging cola and cacao trees to grow. And then when a village moves, which villages do move for all sorts of reasons, political dispute, illness, flooding, or to be near a road, those islands are left, and they're referred to by villagers here as Tombondu, the place of an old village. And these forest islands, again, a bit like the big reserves in Ziama and Gola, are places which embody these overlapping historical legacies. And in walking through them, walking through a forest island with our companions, people would sometimes point out the slightly different appearance and qualities of certain vegetation, which would be indicative of an old cocoa garden, perhaps, or an ancestral grave or a war fence. They would talk about the family histories that had led to the founding of those villages and the particular quarters in the zone. And they talk about the village decisions to keep parts of it intact, perhaps to recognize and memorialize the power of a still living family, whereas to allow other parts to be felled for economic reasons, for farming or for tree felling. They point out too the particular rocks or trees that were the homes of Jina, those capricious bush spirits that some people would consider as the region's original inhabitants, with whom people had negotiated when they arrived and wished to settle. So these forest islands are places of practical encounter, absolutely, but also of intimate, more than human relations between successive generations of people and the plants, animals, and other beings with whom they co-inhabit. So the final West African story turns to soils, because underlying these forest islands throughout this region are emplaced histories of human-soil relations. People here in this region very often distinguish between red soils and black soils. And the black soils are most commonly found in rings around inhabited villages and in the patches of land where settlements and farm encampments used to be. And the reason for that is that they form through the everyday deposition of cooking waste, char from cooking fires, waste from processing palm oil and agricultural products behind women's kitchens, such as to start to form a black charry layer, which over time and through gardening and the burying of waste through gardening, which women often do because these places become very fertile, can build up into something very deep. So women in a lot of this region, and this is an example from Wenwuta in Lofa County in Liberia, where we work with James Fraser and Liberian researchers, people say things like, well, God makes the soil, but we made it fertile. And the explanation of this elderly woman in Wenwuta here explains the process. And the soil transformation is durable, and it often leads to, when people move from a site, to woody vegetation growing. So whole territories come to be a mosaic of what in Liberian English people call old spots, and in Mande languages they tend to call tombondu. And this is an example of a village territory in Lofa County, Liberia, with those spots. Notably, these soils are also incredibly carbon rich. And as we wrote with some soil scientists interested in forest carbon, we've got here an example of what you might call African dark earths, which could be seen as a sort of indigenous biochar, a lot of interest in soil carbon, perhaps something that could be built on. But importantly, these in-place patches of black soil convey to the people who live with them meanings that actually aren't very much about carbon at all. They're about soil fertility, but they're also about the histories that created them, the histories of cultivation and of family and political relations that shaped the creation of particular farm sites and the settlement and moving of villages. These lifeways in dark earth in West Africa are echoed too in other parts of the pluriverse. So in the Amazon, similar soils, and the soil science shows them to be kind of sort of very, very much analogues, have long been known and studied by historical ecologists, archaeologists, and soil scientists who recognize them as terra preta. And patches of these dark earths, terra preta, underlie areas of Amazonian forest that were once assumed to be primary, pristine forest, as the legacy of soil transformations, mostly by indigenous populations going back to 2,000 years ago, but often cut off with European conquest and the depopulation around 500 years ago that happened as these places were taken over and indigenous populations were decimated by the epidemics brought by European conquerors. So there's a legacy here, which is a legacy and stories told of great violence and dispossession, in a sense enshrined in these anthropogenic soils. Or we can move into North America, where I've become incredibly inspired, actually, in recent years, as I'm sure many others have, by the accounts of Robin Kimmerer, who is both a biologist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation, who provides in her extraordinary valuable accounts which actually look at how indigenous knowledge and wisdom and contemporary science can be blended, provides some really striking stories too of what I'm terming forest lifeways. Again, revealing the kind of dynamics of these more than human worlds over time. So, for instance, she tells of the pecan groves that occupy lowland and streamside areas threaded across the prairies of the American Midwest, where the pecans all tend to fruit together at quite unpredictable intervals every few years, a boom and bust cycle known as mast fruiting, from which both people and squirrels benefit, aligned in a kind of feast and famine sort of harvesting practice. Many forest ecologists have interpreted this in kind of ecosystem explanations, quite mechanical explanations of synchrony, which relate to a sort of predator-prey hypothesis and the upping and downing of the different populations. But Kimmerer prefers relational explanations, which blend some of the more recent science of fungal networks in trees with the theorizing of the Potawatomi citizens that she lives with. And the argument here is that it's the fungal networks that redistribute carbohydrates from tree to tree, supported by the decision-making, the collective decision-making in a council of pecans, which together weave a web of reciprocity of giving and taking, a mutual flourishing, which, as she puts it, enables soil, fungus, tree, squirrel, and people to benefit together. Here, as amongst some other American First Nations people, ways of being envisage forest trees as kin, even persons, with their own particular places in more than human social worlds. And yet again, and perhaps unsurprisingly, these forests archive human history and more than human history. So the pecan groves here occupy a landscape in which First Nations people have experienced extreme and appalling subjugation and violence over a past century in which the enforced movements of human populations onto reservations and into more individualized forms of land tenure disrupted many, many aspects of people's entanglements with land and its non-human inhabitants. A heritage that's documented in museums like this one, but also that's lived. And the remaining pecan groves offer forms of reciprocity and mutuality that have been lost in many other areas of life. The synchronization of the Potawatomi gathering of nations is often aligned with the mass fruiting. And this is important, as Kimmerer and her colleagues argue, not only materially to feed the gathering, but also culturally, sort of really bringing out that mutual reciprocity. I live in the UK, and one doesn't have to go far afield or to go to other worlds from those with which one is living in a day-to-day way to find these forest lifeways. This kind of conviviality is here in Europe, not so far from Italy, and very much amongst industrial urbanites too, I would argue, although often obscured and sometimes delegitimized by formal science and education. Take just briefly the southeast UK, where I live, where the historical ecologies of forests and woodlands have been the focus of some monumental works, such as those of Oliver Rackham, sadly now deceased, but until quite recently part of the Cambridge world of the study of forest and his many students, which again debunked narratives of human disturbance of forest and showed again much more complex layered legacies of patterns of woodland interaction and composition and management over time. And the moves we're now seeing in southeast England towards tree regeneration, enrichment planting, protection in nature reserves and national parks very much build on and lock into these past legacies, whether in soil or tenurial associations. And the resulting forests too, and woodlands, are often experienced also in more than human relational ways. And I can get personal here. A few years ago, my husband, James Fairhead, and I, with whom I did all that work, and our children, started to plant trees in an old pasture land, which in a field, in a small holding close to where we live, in the foothills of the South Downs in the UK. And over time, the oak, hawthorn, beech, hazel, and other saplings began to grow, to shape the soils, the undergrowth thickened, numerous birds and insects have become inhabitants or regular visitors. This is a place that's gradually becoming something that you might call a woodland, a kind of forest in the making. And we wander within it and we sit amongst all of it, not just with kind of ecologists or even anthropologists, sort of observational interests, but also with pleasure, with emotion, with love, if you like. Surprising ourselves often how this nascent forest has come to feel like a community of kin, a sort of extension of our own circle of family and acquaintances, and one that we also nurture and care for, whether it's with practical things like extra water in prolonged dry periods, or simply in worry and our visits to go, how are these trees doing? Are they okay? Is this community fine? And then for many people, I mean, we're lucky enough to be kind of living in a little growing forest. For many, of course, forests are far less familiar, yet might satisfy desires to be in the unfamiliar or to get out of a more urban, industrial, everyday life, enabling a switch, perhaps, a difference from habitual daily worlds, but also perhaps an opportunity to connect, even if briefly, in a more than human community. I think this helps us understand the appeal of actively promoted forest immersions and forest baths, something that's advertised to us now in the UK and is indeed promoted on the websites of illustrious scientific organisations like the Royal Botanic Gardens of Kew. These are curated, immersive experiences that sometimes take their origins and their claims to sort of validity from philosophies like the Japanese philosophy that inspires Helena Skoog's forest bathing experiences. But I think one might ask, is it that these curated experiences work precisely because they're kind of social? They involve engaging with a lively, relational place. Perhaps also a connection with the historical legacies of that landscape. Perhaps we might ask, is that what makes us somehow feel good or refreshed or whatever it is we feel when we take a walk or sit or spend time in woodland and forest? Whatever the precise emotion, I think it is clear that very often there is emotion. And again, this is far more than livelihoods. So, if these stories are telling us something about what I'm calling forest lifeways, what are the implications? And what are the implications for what I'm now beginning to think about as conservation justice, working now in an institute that is all about conservation and restoration, but also about justice in that endeavour. And I think there are really three areas. The first, building out of that sense of histories and layered legacies. The idea that from war to epidemics, to trade, to climate, events and changes over time shape people's interactions with forest assemblages, and how they respond in turn sets the stage for further impacts and responses. I think we can and should think about how external interventions in the name of forest protection, conservation, biodiversity, carbon, climate, interlock with these histories. And so it is that a long-standing place like the Gola Rainforest Reserve becomes an archive, not just of farming and war, colonial wars, timber, cacao, and so on. It also becomes an archive of reservation and protection and conservation, first for timber, then for biodiversity, and for watersheds, and now for carbon too. Each of these leaves its mark on vegetation quality, but also on social memories and heritage, on claims to tenure, claims to control. And I wonder if we should be doing more to recognise these as part of what we might want to think about as restorative justice, which acknowledges and perhaps seeks to repair historical injustice. The second implication turns to this whole area in forest lifeways around ways of being. The suggestion that forest assemblages in a diversity of ways are nevertheless often experienced as more than human in-place communities in which plants, animals, soils, spiritual beings, and people cohabit. Cultural contexts vary, whether trees are considered as persons or kin vary, but the point is that these are relations amongst them, and people live as part of them, as part of what I tend to refer to these days as nature kind, recognizing our embedded place as part of nature, not separate people relating to nature. And these are relations that are partly social and socioeconomic, delivering livelihood benefits, ecosystem services, framings that are easily compatible with capitalism and commoditization. But thriving and well-being depends too on some less compatible framings, which refer to the ongoing ordering and thriving and mutual care in more than human communities. Appreciating these ways of being perhaps are going to be important if we're genuinely going to do just conservation that works with people to co-design interventions, engaging with communities in ways that are properly respectful and appreciative. But it also suggests the need then for what we might call justice amongst different ways of being, ontological justice. And we might also want to look towards multi-species justice that recognizes the subject of justice not just as human beings, but perhaps as more than human communities, multi-species communities, opening up opportunities to deal, I think, with some very interesting and exciting legal frameworks around rights of nature and earth jurisprudence, which take us, I think, in some new and important directions for forests. And then the third area is really about ways of knowing and the kind of knowledge and evidence that we might want to bring to bear in understanding and working in forests. Eschewing the assumption that people only or inevitably disturb natural forest vegetation opens up possibilities through a lifeways approach to recognize and support far more positive practices and experiences, those of regeneration and restoration, on which perhaps interventions might seek to build. This is much more, though, than indigenous knowledge viewed as something technical and intentional, because it also encompasses ways of knowing that are cultural and they're embedded in experience, and they're not always so fully conscious. They're about reflecting on, appreciating, and sometimes hitching on, rather less consciously, to the flow of life. And to understand these things, socioeconomic surveys, participatory livelihood analysis and mapping only go so far. I think there may be a need to triangulate a bit more deeply with evidence that's historical, that's ethnographic, that's really tapping into indigenous and local forms of theorizing, and perhaps also with the arts, visual, oral, musical, that help with the storytelling that builds on those traditions and tells stories in culturally appropriate and embedded modes. Such ways of knowing and their concepts may well diverge from post-Enlightenment science, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for accommodation. That's what the kind of work that Robin Kimmerer and others are doing in North America are attempting to seek, a kind of hybridity. It's what I think the conversations that I've tried to engage in with colleagues over the years, pushing those conversations have tried to do. And it's certainly what Nyamjo, to go back to his great work, calls when he talks about a convivial scholarship approach as an alternative to colonial science, which offers a better understanding of the world by centering ways of thinking, which really explicitly connect multiple traditions and is open to dialogue across them. So this points to the need for another kind of justice, epistemic justice amongst ways of knowing. So finally, let's go back to that diagram and see that a lifeways lens adds, I think, to the notions of justice and equity we might want to explore. It expands and deepens the recognitional beyond simply the way it's often used, stakeholders and a politics of presence and difference, to include more deeper recognition of ways of being and ways of knowing, ontological and epistemic forms of justice and recognition. The who in the middle there comes to include not this equity of who and what in the human world, but also to bring in multi-species forms of justice as well. And then attention to history brings in this concern with restorative justice as an aspect of distribution. Many, many ways to take that forward, but I think the sort of conceptual markers that these are things we need to perhaps engage with and reflect on more deeply are there. And I think this all foregrounds power in all its manifestations, the material power, the political economy, and sometimes the sheer violence enwrapped with lifeways in forests, and sometimes suppressing them, as well as the discursive power, that kind of power and knowledge that often allows dominant stories to prevail over others, which sometimes foregrounds the narrow, the mechanistic, the economistic, ones that obscure those stories that tell of forest lives and lifeways, but also discursive power that can be countered if we try to bring those stories to the fore. So, in conclusion, I'm quite convinced these days that amidst the many crises that we're dealing with, the challenge before us is to foster and safeguard hopeful and caring futures for forests and their more than human life. I think that couldn't be more important, and it also couldn't be more urgent. But despite the urgency, that shouldn't blinker us and shouldn't be an excuse to gloss over the issues that actually matter to forest inhabitants. Issues that must, I think, include livelihoods and governance, but also go beyond them to engage more attentively and appreciatively with what I'm calling forest lifeways and the justice and power relations that are wrapped up with those. Thank you very much. Yeah. Sure, happy to take any questions or comments or thoughts or reactions of any sort.
Thank you so much. This was a very inspiring talk, and I was really taken by how you have embraced these questions of epistemic justice and ontological justice. On epistemic justice, I'm just curious on your take on how do we separate the better from the good stories from the stories that do not resonate with, let's say, reality. Is there a danger to fall into post-truth if we embrace all forms of ontology and epistemology? And if we are to avoid that, what kind of guidance could you give us?
Yeah. Really good question. I mean, stories have to have evidence behind them. And stories can't just float free in a post-truth world. And what I've always been interested in the work I've done with others, and I hope in the stories I've told here, these are not just opinions that come out of nowhere. They're actually backed by evidence, and that evidence is of different kinds. It's sometimes evidence that comes from what aerial photographs or ecological analysis tell us about the qualities of vegetation and plants and soils in a place, but it's also evidence that can triangulate with qualitative evidence from people and with experiential evidence and forms of expertise that come from being with and in a landscape. I think where we should be challenging stories is where they're floating free of evidence or even running in the face of them. And that's where some of the stories I've foregrounded here absolutely challenge this kind of big story about people disturbing natural forests. That is a fundamental kind of myth which has often very little evidence behind it. Plenty of politics, plenty of interests, plenty of discursive power enwrapped with seeing things that way, because it can often drive a sense of urgency, back the arguments that this is an important, pristine primary forest under pressure for the first time, therefore it's urgent to protect it now. And also becomes supported very often in some of the claims to being robust measurement techniques, which are now, for instance, being used to justify and legitimize forest carbon schemes, those which are claiming that if you didn't have this project, the trajectory would be forest disappearance, and we know that by extrapolating forward what seemed to be the history of that forest. So the use of mythical histories becomes part of methods and measurement techniques for justifying the future. But so I think we always need to be asking what kinds of evidence are being used to support the stories, and some kinds of evidence holds more water than others. Sure.
Melissa Esteve Corbera from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Your talk was super inspiring, and I think it speaks very clearly about how your framework and way of thinking about livelihoods, liveways can inform research and what it means for research projects, for example, and embracing all this diversity of epistemologies. Yeah. But I'm going to ask a kind of, I think, a difficult question. How do you think that your framework really turns upside down the way that environmental policy is thought about, right? I mean, you already now mentioned the problem with carbon markets, etc., but I wonder whether you've been thinking about how this way of thinking would transform completely the way we think about policy, right? And challenging the idea of policy panaceas. How do you imagine policy making to be if thought through this framework? That would be my question. Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
I think the challenge to environmental policy making comes at several different levels. So, I mean, Esteva, it's great to see you, and you're familiar with, and we've worked and thought together on many of these questions about the ways in which environmental policy making is informed by different kinds of science and knowledge, and the extent to which it's appreciative of the actual dynamics, the on-the-ground dynamics between people and forests, which is encaptured in questions about livelihoods and governance. And all of that still remains really, really important. So environmental policy, I would argue, absolutely needs to take seriously livelihoods and governance questions. What I think I've come to suggest, and this comes out of several different experiences, partly revisiting some of my earlier forest work in the light of, I think, the really important sort of post-humanities and the work on the more than human in anthropology and in geography, and the new rapprochements with indigenous ontologies and ways of thinking, which I think is challenging scientific framings in new and interesting and important ways. And also great interest in the way that environmental and ecological politics, I would say more than policy at this point, is and needs to be driven by passion and emotion and connections with nature, which are sometimes aesthetic, sometimes lived and experiential, as well as those more kind of logical and economic connections, which I always used to analyse before. So the coming together of those two things are things I've been exploring slightly differently and revisiting some earlier work. Now, the idea of, and I've also been thinking about the implications for justice. Now, a lifeways approach is actually something I invented for this talk, okay? So, I've got a book coming out with James Fairhead called Nature Kind, which is about more than human connection and communication, actually, which draws on some of this. The communication stuff I haven't covered. The idea of lifeways seemed to be quite a nice way of speaking with the more established livelihoods and governance work, which I imagined has always been a big concern to Flair. And I thought that might be an interesting way of encapsulating some of this more recent thinking and bringing it to this audience. So to sort of backtrack to your question, I think all those arguments about environmental policy needing to engage with livelihoods and governance and the real dynamics of human-forest relations, absolutely there. What I would now add is that environmental policymakers might need to recognize their own personhood, their citizenship, their own connections as people with nature, maybe in the places that they live and where they come from, or maybe in the environments they're working in, and perhaps to be more prepared to recapture some of what's perhaps in their everyday experiences or what they learned from their parents or grew up with in a rural setting, but have conveniently forgotten because it's not part of their training as environmental scientists or foresters, and recapture some of it as a way of then building the connections which can drive passion and may allow a more respectful kind of communication with the people for whom more than human worlds have always been germane to ways of living all along.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. My name's Katie, I'm from the University of Manchester. I want to ask a practical question about your current role as director of CCI. Now, obviously, as you said, under the umbrella of CCI, you've got institutions like Flora and Fauna, WCS, who have been involved in practical conservation and restoration on the ground for a very long time, and may have been involved in some of the mistakes made in the past. And so I can imagine that maybe you've had some interesting discussions in the coffee room. And so my question is, as director, are you able to kind of encourage these institutions to think about some of these things? And if so, how kind of perceptive are they to these ideas?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question, and a very apt one. And there are some CCI colleagues of mine in this room with whom I have these conversations. So the first thing to say is, I mean, most people won't necessarily know what CCI is. It's a really interesting collaboration that kind of came into being properly about 10 years ago, bringing together on a kind of conservation campus in a single building in Cambridge, the global offices of now 10 of the world's leading conservation organizations with the University of Cambridge and its many disciplines, including anthropology, where I'm based, but also ecology and more originally, much more ecology, zoology, biology. And sort of 10 years on, I am its new director. I have a slightly different profile from previous directors who were mostly conservation biologists. And the task is to make and help these organizations to build synergies, to work together, to collaborate, to be more than the sum of their parts. So I think the first thing is that there is an absolute appetite to have someone who perhaps brought some more social science grounded perspectives to the role, because there is, I think, a real recognition across the conservation community, and certainly amongst the majority of organizations in CCI and staff working there, that engaging with communities and working with the social sciences is massively important. And I think that's been a realization that has partly come out of the evident failure of conservation schemes that haven't done that have excluded people from lands and places and landscapes and seascapes. And you obviously simply can't exclude people who are depending on somewhere for their livelihoods, so there've been encroachments and things have fallen apart. So I think there is real interest, and there are actually quite a lot of social scientists and anthropologists working with some of the major NGOs, including in the projects that I just talked about. And they're doing a fantastic job, and they're working to bring really nuanced understandings of community livelihoods and questions of justice, and doing some really, I think, pioneering work to try and bridge the conversations. How do you communicate what a forest carbon scheme is about to Loma people living around this Yama Reserve? And some of that is I think, really pioneering and really useful. What I'm trying to do is to push a little bit, to work as allies with the social sciences, but also with some of the other conservation organizations, both to emphasize why social sciences and humanities are important to those who perhaps aren't yet recognizing it fully, to support very much the work on decolonizing conservation that's now going on across CCI and its many global networks, and to try to deepen those conversations a little bit. So the kind of perspective I've just presented to you today, I haven't shared yet very much with people in CCI. I'll probably give a seminar in a couple of weeks and we'll see how it goes down. And I think some people will be interested, others will go, what are you talking about? Others might feel challenged, but I feel the conservation world needs to be a place of debate, and it needs to be a place of dialogue, and CCI is a place of collaboration where we should be having those debates. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Hi, I'm Nandita from Dharohar. Thank you for bringing hope into this whole debate. I think this is really needed for everybody to really do their best, and also caring, because These are two words that build connection, and connection is the only thing that can get passion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could you join me again in thanking Professor Leach? So just a couple of quick things. So Professor Leach, we have, so what I would say is apparently we need to change our name.
No, you don't.
No?
You don't. You
The
don't.
Forest and Lifeways network. No, I think it's very interesting for us to think about. So thank you so much for just a wonderful, provocative, inspiring talk. I personally enjoyed it immensely. And it's our birthday.
Happy birthday.
So you've given
Happy
us,
birthday
you've given
for
us
us.
such a great gift of your time and your energy. So thank you so much for that. And we have a very small gift for
lovely.
you, a Flair notebook made here in Italy.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I guess you'll be with us tomorrow so we can continue the conversation. We also have the dinner tonight. But first, I'd like to invite all of us to kind of gather close, find hope, be together, and have a photo. And thank you
Perfect.
to everyone.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Great.